The wheat variety decision tool is designed to be incredibly easy to use. It is an Excel file and it does contain some macros. So when you first open the file, you may be asked whether or not you want to enable macros. Please do so to experience its full functionality. What you are viewing now is the introduction screen. This should be the first screen that you see when you first open the file. In the lower left-hand corner, you will see my contact information. My name is Jay Parsons and I am the author of this tool. Feel free to contact me by phone or by email if you have any questions on the tool or comments you would like to share. And please do share your comments with me, both positive and negative, so that I can continue to refine the tool and make it more useful. The Wheat Variety Decision Tool is a decision support system, or DSS, for wheat producers to help them analyze their variety selection decisions. It will allow you to compare up to 5 alternative varieties based on several different criteria or characteristics. The comparisons are made using the ProMathay and weighted average multi-criteria decision-making algorithms. We will not spend much time during this tutorial talking about the details of these two algorithms or the differences they represent, other than in the context of the different rankings they can sometimes produce for your variety alternatives. Let's begin our tour of the Wheat Variety Decision Tool by clicking the Begin button. This is the main menu of the Wheat Variety Decision Tool. From it, you can access any of the 6 main areas of the tool by clicking one of these buttons. We're going to begin by looking at the wheat variety information by clicking the button in the upper left of the main menu. This is the wheat variety data that drives the variety comparison within the tool. The varieties listed here are those varieties that have had at least a 3-year track record in the Colorado Winter Wheat Variety Performance Trials. The varieties you see listed in the very first column. The second and the third column are their 3-year trial averages for yield and test weight, respectively. That is followed by evaluation scores on 9 different characteristics as provided by the Colorado Wheat Improvement Team. Let us now return to the main menu by clicking the button at the top of the page. Let us now look at the base information we want to use for comparing varieties by clicking the button labeled Enter Base Information. Here we see all of the criteria that we saw listed on our data page, beginning with the yield and test weight 3-year trial averages and working down to the milling and baking quality. The next column over is labeled weights, and you'll notice that all of these contain the number 1 right now, which means that each of the criteria are currently being weighted equally in the decision-making process. These cells have a green background on them, which means they are changeable. So for example, if you wanted yield to be weighted twice as heavily as the rest of the criteria, you could simply click on that cell and change the number 1 to a 2. On the other hand, if one of these criteria you don't want to enter into the calculations at all, you don't think it's important at all, you can always zero it out. So for example, let's say coleoptile length was not important to you. Changing that to a 0 would mean that coleoptile length would not enter into your decision rankings. I'm going to go ahead and change these back to 1 for right now, which means that they're all going to be weighted equally. You'll also notice that in the parameter column we have some green cells. These parameters enter into the ProMathay calculations. In short, ProMathay is an outranking methodology, which means even though you might be ranking 5 different varieties and calculating their ranking scores, they're going to be compared 2 at a time. These parameters represent the difference threshold, or as I like to call it, the indifference threshold for that particular criteria as you compare two varieties. So, for example, the parameter 5 in the yield criteria means that as I compare two varieties to one another, they need to have a difference in yield of at least 5 bushels to the acre before I definitely prefer one variety over the other. By tightening this parameter up or making it smaller, it has the effect of actually placing slightly more emphasis on that criteria. So for example, say two varieties differ by 2 bushels to the acre. If I leave this parameter at 5, that means the higher yielding variety would be scored a 0.4 and the other lower yielding variety would be scored a 0. On the other hand, if I tighten this parameter up to a 2, then that difference of 2 bushels to the acre will have met our indifference threshold, and we'd score the higher yielding variety a 1 and the lower yielding variety a 0. This is a little easier to envision if we click the Type 3 hyperlink underneath the preference function heading. This is a graph of the preference function with a yield difference set at 5. On this graph you can see that with a yield difference of 2, as I mentioned, the score for the higher yielding variety would be 0.4 compared to the other variety, which would get a 0. Let's click return and go back to our base information. In the preference function column, you see that both yield and test weight use a linear preference function, which means that the preference score of one variety over another for those criteria is going to be calculated between 0 and 1 in a linear fashion, depending upon the difference between the two different varieties and the parameter chosen for the difference threshold. The Russian wheat aphid resistance criteria is going to be scored using an insensitive preference function, which means the variety will get a 0 or a 1 because Russian wheat aphid resistance is either a 0 if they don't have it or a 1 if they do. The remaining criteria are all scored using a Gaussian preference function, which operates very similar to the linear preference function, except for it's nonlinear. In the Gaussian preference function, the parameter, which is 3 in this case for all of these criteria, represents the difference threshold at which you really start to prefer one variety over the other. Let's look at the heading date Gaussian function graph to get a feel for this. The impact of having a nonlinear preference function such as this is that very small differences are treated a little bit differently than big differences, meaning that they're less impactful on the ranking scores. Let's return back to the base information by hitting the return button here. It's important that you get comfortable with this base information page and changing these numbers for the weights and the parameters to fit your personal preferences. This wheat variety decision tool is not necessarily designed to give you my recommendation. It's designed for you to build your own recommendation based off of what you feel is most important for your situation. Now let's return to the main menu. Now it's time to finally look at the varieties that we want to compare. Let's do this by clicking the View Payoff Matrix button. I've pre-populated this with the 5 varieties above, Bill Brown, Bond CL, Hatcher, and Ripper. And you see the data attached to each of these varieties in the columns below. If you want to compare different varieties, you can simply click on any of the green cells and a drop-down menu will be in place where you can select a different variety. Any of those that you saw in your data table are here to choose from. For now, let's go ahead and leave these 5 varieties in, and let's return to the main menu. Once those varieties are selected, you can go ahead and view their ranking results by clicking the button at the bottom. And here are the results. ProMathay actually provides 2 different rankings. One of them is a partial ranking of domination, and the other is a full ranking I'll show you those a little bit more detail here in a moment when we look at the ProMathay calculations. The weighted average just provides a complete ranking. You can see from the results that Bill Brown and Ripper appear to be the top two varieties among these. Bill Brown is ranked first in the ProMathay method, and by the listing of the numbers 1, 3, 4, and 5 in the dominates column, we can see that not only is it first in the full ranking, but it actually dominates each of the other four varieties according to the ProMathay method. On the weighted average ranking, however, it only ranks second, and it's second to Ripper, which, on the other hand, is second to Bill Brown in the ProMathay rankings. And Ripper dominates both above and Bond, but not Hatcher. Hatcher is a solid 3 in these rankings, and then take your pick, above and Bond CL are ranked 4th and 5th. Let's return to the main menu now. And very quickly, I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of the ProMathay and the weighted average calculations. Let's start with the ProMathay by clicking the button in the middle. As I mentioned earlier, ProMathay is an outranking methodology. To simplify things, let's just focus on the right 3 columns. The positive flow, which is calculated by summing across the rows on the left, describes how prone particular varieties are to be better than the other varieties for each criteria. From the numbers we see here, Bill Brown with 0.833 is the variety that's most prone to be better than another variety for any given criteria. The negative flow, which is calculated by summing down the columns on the left, describes how prone a variety is to be worse than another variety for a particular criteria. Again, we see here that Bill Brown with the lowest score here of 0.384 is a variety that's least likely to be worse than the other varieties for a given criteria. The fact that Bill Brown turns out to have the highest positive flow and the lowest negative flow is why it turns out to be dominant over the other four varieties in the ProMathay methodology. The net flow in the far right hand column is simply taking the positive flow minus the negative flow, and that's the calculation that provides us the full ranking of ProMathay 2. Let's return to the main menu. Now let's look at the weighted average calculations. The weighted average calculations are shown here. The total desirability rankings in the bottom row are what determines the rankings that you saw on the previous results page. The main difference between the weighted average methodology and the ProMathay methodology is the idea that ProMathay has that indifference area. The reason that's so important is because sometimes you have data very tightly bunched, and it's tightly bunched within close enough together that you really are indifferent between the two varieties or the two alternatives that you're considering. ProMathay will pick that up and essentially score them all equally in that criteria. Weighted average will not. The weighted average methodology simply takes the best and makes it a 5, the worst and makes it a 1, and everything else is in between. So you could have data very tightly bunched and end up with a bunch of 1s and 5s even though they're only 1 unit apart. So, in short, how different the weighted average calculates things and ProMathay calculates things is determined by the data itself. As you can probably tell from my description, I'm a strong proponent of ProMathay because of the flexibility those parameters, those indifference parameters, provide. Let's now return to the main menu. Let's take one more look at those ranking results. Keep in mind these rankings were calculated based off the fact that we had each of the criteria weighted equally. I seriously doubt that everybody would do that. So let's take a look at changing those weights a little bit and see if that changes our rankings. Let's return to the main menu. Now let's go to the base information page. Let's make a couple of changes here. First of all, let's weight yield twice as heavily as the other criteria. Second of all, stripe rust is an issue in our area. So let's go down and let's weight stripe rust twice as important as the other criteria. And third of all, to strengthen up the relationship with yield, let's go ahead and lower this parameter down to 2 bushels to an acre. And now suppose coleoptile length isn't really that important to us, so let's zero that criteria out. Now let's return to the main menu. And let's view our ranking results. So we see that our rankings have now changed. Bill Brown is number 1 in either one of the methods and dominates each of the other 4. Ripper is definitely a second, Hatcher third, Bond fourth, and Above fifth. This may or may not be the ranking you would give these varieties depending upon the weights and the parameters you would provide for each of those criteria. Now let's return to the main menu. Let's take a look at the Payoff Matrix. These are the 5 varieties that we've been comparing. Above and Bond CL are consistently ranking 4th and 5th no matter what we put in for the weights on the different criteria. Let's go ahead and replace them with the other varieties and see if we can get some other alternatives that might be more competitive with Bill Brown, Hatcher, and Ripper. So let's select the Above key, and let's go down and let's go ahead and replace this with Settler CL, which is a little higher yielding variety, as you can see here. Now let's return to the main menu, and let's go look at those rankings. Okay. The rankings show that Bill Brown is still number 1. Settler CL came in second, pushing Ripper down to third. Hatcher was 4th, and Bond CL 5th. Now let's say Bond CL is doing poorly on each of these. Let's go ahead and eliminate that from the comparison and just see how those other 4 work out. If I want to eliminate Bond CL, I simply need to backspace and delete that choice and zero out that column. Now I'll just be comparing these top 4 varieties. Let's view the rankings. And here we are. We can see here that by taking Bond CL out of the picture, that it changes the ranking slightly for Settler CL and Ripper. No longer is Settler second in the weighted average method, but it's dropped down to third, while Ripper has moved up to second. And now Bill Brown dominates Hatcher, and that's it in terms of the domination among the different varieties. Again, this is all based off of the weights you give to the different criteria and the parameters that you provide for each of them. Let's go back and take a look at the data for these 4 varieties. Let's start by looking at yield. By making yield twice as important as most of the other criteria, we're showing favoritism towards Settler CL and Ripper, the 2 highest yielding varieties. By eliminating coleoptile length from consideration, remember we set its weight to 0, we're giving a heads up to Bill Brown here, which has a very short coleoptile length compared to the other varieties, but is not being dinged for it in our rankings. Also remember, we gave a high weight to stripe rust resistance. By doing so, we hurt the ranking of Ripper, which has relatively low stripe rust resistance compared to the other varieties. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that might affect these rankings if we return the stripe rust resistance weight to just 1. By just changing that 1 weight, Ripper now looks a lot better than Settler CL. Not only is it higher in the ranking columns on the right, but if we look at the ProMathay 1 column, we see it actually dominates both Settler and Hatcher. Hopefully this demonstrates that the rankings that come out of this particular tool are highly dependent upon what you think is important among those criteria. Therefore, it's very important to get this base information page right for the decision you're trying to make. Make sure that these weights reflect your personal preferences among these different criteria and how important you think they are to your decision. Do the same with the parameters on the right to reflect how sensitive you want the calculations to be to differences between the different varieties for a particular criteria. That brings us to the conclusion of this tutorial. Hopefully you find this tool useful as you compare different varieties and make your wheat planting decisions. Once again, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments you would like me to hear so that I can continue to refine this tool to help best meet producers' needs. Thank you for viewing this tutorial and taking a look at the wheat variety decision tool.